Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We welcome you to the Bio Bus Center, streaming live from the Bio International Convention 2012 in Boston, Massachusetts. Bio recently commissioned a report on intellectual property rights and their role on the biotechnology innovation system in developing and developed countries. And that report was recently released here at the Bio International Convention. I have with me a senior researcher who participated in that report, Dr. David Tortensson, who is a senior consultant to the Pugac Concilium, who compiled the report on behalf of Bio, doing its own independent research in this area and promising to tell us some interesting new insights that we perhaps weren't quite aware of before. So, Dr. Tortensson, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Very happy to have you here. I will yield the floor to you with my first question, and that is, how do you view your report as contributing to the field of scholarship in intellectual property generally?
I think the main thing that we've done with the report, and this goes for our work more generally, is that the conversation about intellectual property rights is often quite theoretical. It's often quite emotional. The approach that we take is an evidence-based approach. So we try to conduct as much empirical research as possible. We look at the data. What does the data actually tell us? Secondly, we try, and for this report in particular, to take a more holistic approach. So yes, we look at the role of intellectual property rights with regard to the biotech ecosystem, but we also look at intellectual property rights more broadly. So the relationship between IPRs and economic growth, economic development, and innovation more generally.
So particularly in the area of biotechnology, how, as an outcome of the research that you've done, would you view the role of IP in the life sciences, as opposed to perhaps some other industry sectors who may use intellectual property in different ways?
I think one of our key findings, and it's quite clear that IPRs are essential, both at the upstream and downstream level. And you can see this in the evidence. You can see that biotech entities, whether they be universities, SMEs, or big companies, are using intellectual property rights. There's been a tremendous increase in patenting activity over the last 30 years. You can see this in increased university patenting as well. You can see this in the number of licensing agreements, the number of research, technology transfer, alliances, and partnerships. So there's a whole host of indicators that sort of show how biotech entities are using intellectual property rights in their day-to-day activities.
Mm-hmm. So, and all that is in your report. I
Yes,
look forward to an interesting read. Now, I'm looking over the exhibition floor, which you viewers can't see, but if you come to Bio, it's quite a sight. There are lots of pavilions that I see from emerging markets, developing countries. There seems to be, as in last year's, a tremendous interest in transferring and bringing biotechnology, not just from the developed markets, but also into developing markets and the like. Often in conversations with these countries, intellectual property rights, the proper management of intellectual property rights, and how to grow and achieve an orderly development, I guess, of law and regulation and intellectual property in emerging markets becomes a subject for interesting discussion. There's a lot of need for information and the like. So especially with respect to developing markets, what does your report tell us about the importance of intellectual property rights in that context?
Well, I think to begin with, and if we want to focus in on biotech specifically, you can see I described the increase in biotechnology patenting activity that's taken place. That's also taking place in emerging economies. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of emerging economies that are increasing their use of patenting to protect their intellectual property. That's trend number one. The other trend is that you can see an increase in alliances and partnerships based on research and technology transfer in emerging economies as well. Mm-hmm. To give you a few examples, well, I think, actually before I get into some examples, I think more broadly, if you look at IPRs and if you look at the nations that want to compete, they want to attract investment, they want to build a vibrant bioeconomy, there's a convergence. you can see that they are trying to strengthen their intellectual property rights frameworks. It's not perfect, but the nations and countries that are the most successful, such as Korea, Singapore, over time, you can see a trend, and it's a strengthening of IPRs.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting, and it reminds me of something that's also often observed about China, which has seen a tremendous growth in the use of and participation in intellectual property systems. The Chinese Patent Office is now one of the busiest patent offices in the world, for example, and that seems to go hand in hand with a very clear concerted effort at growing in the biotech space, the local manufacturing base, the local development base, and to transform China not just from a market, but also into a source of innovation, and that seems to go hand in hand with the growth and use of the patent system, the Chinese patent system, and the Chinese are actively patenting also in other countries. So that too, like from my own experience as BIO's patent lawyer, I see that, and so that's, I think, a very interesting trend that you tell us is picking up more globally. Fascinating developments. I think your report has, to me, been a very interesting read. It will be available on BIO's website. It will be available, I believe, on the through the Pugach Concilium as well.
On our website as well. Be sure to download it and have a look.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was that. This is Hans Sauer, BIO's Deputy General Counsel for IP. I thank you very much for watching, and I thank Dr. Tortensson for being with us here this morning.
My pleasure.